good evening, or perhaps wherever you are it's already deep into the night. Either way, I'm glad you're here. I'm John, and this is the place I come to tell the stories of great ships, the ones built too large, too costly, too proud for the eras that made them. Tonight's ship is one of the strangest and most beautiful of them all. Before we begin, let the room settle around you. Let the lights come down if they haven't already. Turn your phone face down, let your shoulders drop into whatever is holding you up tonight, and stop trying so hard to stay awake. You don't need to remember anything from this story. You only need to let it happen to you. If you'd like, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now, settle in. There's a ship waiting for us on the Thames. She came down the river gilded from bow to stern, so thick with gold leaf that men standing on the bank said she looked like a second sun had risen out of the water. Sailors who had spent their whole lives at sea, who thought they had seen every kind of vessel a kingdom could build, stood on the mud at low tide and simply stared. She was not, in truth, the largest ship afloat, but she was the most extravagant thing anyone had ever set upon salt water, and the cost of her nearly broke the patience of a kingdom that could not afford her. Her name was the Sovereign of the Seas. You would have known her before you saw her whole. Even at a distance, even through river mist, the gold caught the light in a way nothing else on the water did, not the sails, not the brass fittings on lesser ships, not even the sun itself when it broke low and orange over the marshes at Woolwich. It moved with her, shifting as she rocked at anchor, so that she seemed less like a built thing and more like something that had simply arrived, fully formed, out of some other and richer world. Carved figures climbed her stern in tiers, kings, virtues, beasts twisting around each other in gilded wood. And if you had stood beneath her at the waterline, craning your neck upward, you would have understood almost immediately why the ordinary business of the yard around her seemed to stop whenever she was mentioned. She was the kind of thing people rearranged their day to go and look at. It was the year 1637 when she first came down the ways at Woolwich, on a stretch of the Thames that had built ships for the Crown for the better part of a century. The yard smelled the way all yards of that age smelled: tar and raw sawdust, the faint rot of the mudflats at low water, wood smoke drifting from the workers' fires even in the warmer months, because pitch and paint both wanted heat to do their work properly. If you had walked the quay that year, past the rope walks and the timber stacks taller than houses, you would have heard her before you saw her. The low, continuous knock of adzes and mallets, dozens of them, none quite in time with the others, a sound that never really stopped from one week to the next. She had been 3 years in the building by the time she was ready to leave that noise behind her, and every one of those years had been paid for, argued over, and watched with a kind of nervous fascination by people who had never expected a ship to become the subject of quite so much conversation. Ships were built at Woolwich all the time. This one was different, and everyone along that stretch of river seemed to sense it early, in the size of the timber being hauled up from the yard's stores, in the number of carvers and gilders brought in alongside the usual shipwrights, in the simple fact that the man overseeing her build kept revising his own estimates of what she would eventually cost. There is nothing you need to hold on to yet. Just let the picture sit there in the dark behind your eyes, the gold, the river, the noise of a yard building something it had never quite built before. The story will come to you slowly, the way these things always do, and you don't have to catch every piece of it as it passes. But who would spend a fortune like that on a single ship, and who would be trusted to actually build it? The answer to the first question was a king who had, by 1637, stopped calling Parliament altogether. Charles I had been ruling without it for the better part of a decade, funding his government through means that did not require anyone's consent but his own, and among the projects that money went toward was a navy he believed his kingdom deserved, a fleet that could match anything France or Spain or the Dutch republics put to sea. He was not, by most accounts, a man given to half measures when it came to how his authority ought to look from the outside. A king who ruled alone wanted a ship that looked as though no one on earth could tell him otherwise, and the Sovereign of the Seas was built, in no small part, to be looked at, a floating argument for a certain idea of what kingship was, aimed as much at the courts of Europe as at any enemy fleet. The man handed the task of turning that ambition into oak and iron was Phineas Pett, and if you had asked anyone at Woolwich who he was, they would have told you before you'd finished the question. The Petts had been building ships for the English crown for 3 generations by then, a family trade passed down the way a smith's trade or a mason's trade was passed down, father teaching son the particular judgment it takes to look at a piece of standing timber and know what kind of ship it wants to become. Phineas himself had already built ships that mattered, fast ones, sound ones, ships that had done exactly what they were asked to do, but nothing in his long career had prepared the yard, or perhaps prepared Pett himself, for what the king now wanted him to attempt. Not simply a large ship, but the largest and most ornamented warship England had ever tried to put to sea, built to a design so ambitious that other shipwrights, when they heard the specifications, openly doubted it could float at all. He took the commission anyway. Of course he did, and over the years that followed, in that same yard full of tar smoke and mallet strikes, he would spend himself building something that would either crown his family's long service to the crown or become the most expensive mistake the English Navy had ever financed. That is where we're headed tonight, into the forests that were felled to build her, into the arguments over her design, into the gold that covered her and the debt that followed her, and finally into the fire that would, many years later, bring the whole gleaming story to an end on a quiet stretch of river no one was watching closely enough. But first, we need to go back a little further than Woolwich, back to the kingdom itself and to the particular uneasy silence of a king ruling without the one body that might have told him no. Parliament had last sat in 1629, and by the time the keel for the sovereign was laid, most people in the yard had grown used to a kingdom that ran on the king's word alone. It changed how money moved. Without a parliament to argue over spending, Charles turned to older, stranger levies to fund what he wanted built, among them a tax on ship money itself, charged to counties that had no coastline at all, which tells you something about how badly the Crown wanted this fleet and how little patience it had for objections. You did not have to understand the politics of it to feel the effect at Woolwich. The money simply kept arriving, month after month, in amounts that made older shipwrights uneasy even as they welcomed the work. If your eyes are already closing, that's exactly right. None of this needs to be held on to. What matters is only that a king without a parliament had decided quietly and absolutely that England would have the grandest ship in Europe, whatever it cost him, and whatever it cost the men who had to explain later where all that gold had actually gone. England in those years was not entirely without government, whatever the pamphlets abroad liked to suggest. It was a kingdom governed by proclamation instead of debate, by a king who had grown tired of asking men in gowns and chains of office for permission to rule his own country. Charles I had dismissed Parliament and found, to his evident relief, that the sky did not fall. Bills went unsigned, grievances went unheard, and in the quiet that followed, in the absence of anyone empowered to say no, the king discovered something that every treasury minister since has envied, a way of raising money that required no one's consent but his own. You would not have called it a tax if you'd asked at court. It went by an older, gentler name, ship money, a levy with a pedigree stretching back to times when England's coasts needed defending against raiders and rival fleets, and every town near the water was expected to contribute a vessel or the money to hire one for the common good. It was an old rite, dusted off and polished until it shone like something new. The difference this time was that it did not stop at the coast. It moved inland, county by county, farm by farm, until men who had never in their lives seen the sea were asked to pay for its defense. You can imagine how that landed in a market town 2 counties from the nearest tide, the collector arriving with his ledger, the farmer staring at a demand written in the name of ships he would never board, built to fight enemies he would never see. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this, no dates to keep, no sums to carry into the morning. Just the shape of the thing, a king who needed money, a coastline that needed guarding, and a method of paying for both that quietly reached further and further from the water with each passing year. The official reasoning was sound enough, and even the king's critics struggled at first to argue against it outright. Piracy along the Channel was real, Dutch and French fleets were growing. An island kingdom without ships was a kingdom without borders at all, and every councillor who ever whispered in Charles's ear on the subject of the navy could point to a coastline lying open and undefended. The logic held together. What did not hold together for many who paid it was the growing sense that ship money had stopped being about ships at all, that it had become simply a name, a legal fiction dressed in naval cloth for a king raising revenue he could not otherwise touch. Judges were asked to rule on its legality and mostly carefully found in the Crown's favour, though you could hear the discomfort in how narrowly some of those rulings were written. Resentment did not explode. It settled instead, the way damp settles into a house's timbers, quiet and patient and structural, waiting for a season when it would matter. At Woolwich, none of this reached the yard as argument. It reached the yard as coin, reliable, monthly, more generous than shipwrights were accustomed to seeing attached to any single vessel. Phineas Pett, who had already spent a working lifetime building ships for a crown that was frequently slow to pay him, must have noticed the difference even if he never wrote it plainly. The money simply kept coming, drawn from farms and market towns he would never visit, converted somewhere along its journey into oak beams and rope, and the wages of men who could now be kept working through a winter instead of released to find other trades. Whatever unease the tax stirred in the counties, it produced, at the water's edge, something closer to abundance. But a tax alone does not carve an oak stern into the likeness of a king or gild a ship's face until it looks less like a vessel than a jewel someone had decided to set afloat. For that, you needed a different kind of craftsman entirely, not a builder of hulls, but a maker of images, a man whose trade was ornament rather than structure, and whose reputation would in time become almost as tied to this ship as the timber itself. His name was Gerard Christmas, and if you had walked past his workshop in those years, you would have known it before you saw it, the smell reaching you first, sharp with fresh-cut wood and the sweeter, heavier note of gold leaf being prepared, and beneath it all the low tap and scrape of chisels, finding the curve of a lion's mane or the fold of a robe out of a block that had, an hour before, been nothing but timber. Christmas came from a family that had built its name carving the great painted arches London raised for royal processions, the temporary triumphal gateways that lined a coronation route or a royal entry into the city. Structures meant to dazzle for a single afternoon and then be quietly dismantled. He understood, in a way that hull builders like Pett did not need to, how to make wood say something about power. He understood spectacle as a kind of language, and he had spent years learning its grammar on temporary stages built for kings to ride past. What Charles wanted when he came to think about the ship taking shape at Woolwich was not a spectacle that would be dismantled by evening. He wanted that same language of gold and myth and royal likeness carved permanently into something that would sail, a ship that did not merely serve the crown, but wore it, visibly, on every surface a courtier or a rival ambassador might see. You do not commission a man like Christmas if you intend to build a plain fighting vessel. You commission him if some part of you has already decided that this ship exists to be looked at nearly as much as it exists to fight. If your eyes have already closed, let this next part settle in gently rather than sharply. None of it needs remembering, only the feeling of it. Because underneath the ledgers and the levies and the careful legal opinions about whether a landlocked county could rightly be asked to fund a fleet, there was a much simpler truth sitting in the king's own mind, one that no committee had approved and no judge had been asked to rule on. Charles did not merely want a ship strong enough to answer the threats his councillors described. He wanted, privately, almost stubbornly, the largest and most magnificent vessel afloat anywhere in Europe, a ship that other kings would hear about before they ever saw it, carried home in the reports of their own ambassadors, spoken of in ports from Amsterdam to Madrid with the particular mixture of admiration and unease that only genuine excess can produce. It was not, in the end, a decision the Navy had asked for. It was closer to a wish the Navy had been handed, fully formed, and told to make real, and turning a king's private wish into several hundred tons of oak, gold leaf, and rigging was a task that would fall, before long, to men standing in a yard at Woolwich, staring up at a keel that already seemed, even half-built, larger than anything England had laid down before. What that keel required, before it could become anything Christmas would later gild, was wood in a quantity the Woolwich Yard had rarely been asked to gather all at once. You would have heard it before you understood it, the particular groan of a trunk giving way somewhere inland, carried down through forests that had stood since before any living shipwright's grandfather had first picked up an adze. Oak does not hurry. A tree thick enough to frame a warship's rib had likely been growing since a different king sat the throne entirely. And now it was coming down by the hundreds, dragged by ox teams along tracks never built for a load so heavy, toward rivers that could carry it the rest of the way to Woolwich. Somewhere near 4,000 trees, by the estimates that survive, went into the making of her, though no single clerk ever counted them standing. And the figure is really a guess dressed up as a certainty, the kind historians offer because a number, even an uncertain one, is easier to hold than a forest. Pett would have walked among the timber yards at Woolwich in those months the way a man walks among the makings of an argument he has not yet finished composing, checking each beam for the rot or the twist that could undo a season's work before a single plank was laid. And behind him, unseen by anyone counting trees or levies, Gerard Christmas was already sketching the lion that would one day snarl from her prow. The summons itself, when it came, would not have looked like much. A folded letter, sealed, carried by a rider who did not know or care what was inside it. But if you had been standing in the Pett household at Chatham that morning, you would have felt the room change shape around it, the way a house tightens when someone reads a letter twice before speaking. Phineas Pett had built ships for 2 kings already. He knew the weight a piece of paper could carry long before he broke the seal. Charles I did not want a ship. He wanted a statement, and he wanted Phineas Pett to build it for him. The specifications, when they finally reached the yard in full, were less a set of instructions than a wish list assembled by a man who had never once had to explain to a carpenter how such a wish might be made to float. More guns than any English vessel had carried before. A hull raised higher out of the water than custom allowed, so that she would look from any quay in Europe like something built by a kingdom that answered to no one. Carving across every surface that could bear it, stern, prow, rails, the very gunport lids, until the ship herself became a kind of sentence the king was writing to the rest of the world, one nobody could misread. You do not have to understand naval architecture to feel what is being asked for here. It is the same thing asked for in a crown, in a coronation, in a portrait painted 3 feet taller than the man himself. It is grandeur that has stopped pretending to serve any purpose beyond being seen. And it fell to Pett to translate that wish into oak. He was summoned to court not once but several times over that year, and you can imagine, though imagine is the wrong word for something so well documented, the particular discomfort of standing before a king who rules by his own authority alone, no parliament left to argue with him, no body of men to tell him a ship this large might bankrupt the very navy it was meant to glorify. Charles had dissolved Parliament some years before, and had been ruling since on his own judgment and his own purse, which meant that when he wanted something built, there was no one positioned to tell him it could not be afforded or should not be attempted. The money for a ship like this one would come, eventually, from a tax that had not been collected in decades and would be resented all the more for its revival. But that trouble was still ahead of him. In the rooms where Pett stood that year, the only conversation was about splendor and how much more of it the king believed the ship could hold. It is worth sitting for a moment with what it must have meant to be a Pett standing in those rooms. Phineas came from a family that had been building the king's ships for 3 generations, father to son, each one carrying forward not just a trade, but a reputation that could be lost as easily as it had been built. His own son would one day captain this very vessel. His family's name was already stitched so tightly into the timber of the English Navy that a failure here would not merely cost him a commission. It would unmake something his family had spent decades assembling, plank by plank, the same patient way a hull itself gets built. You can hear that pressure in the care he took, in the small hesitations his own notes record. a man doing careful arithmetic in his head while a king, several rooms away, was already imagining the gold leaf. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this. No name or date worth gripping tightly in the dark. Only the shape of the moment. An old shipbuilding family handed a commission bigger than anything they had built before by a monarch who had, for the first time in generations, no one left to answer to but himself. But what does it actually feel like to be handed a commission like this when the men around you who build ships for a living are the very first to doubt whether it can be done at all? Because that doubt was there from the beginning, and it did not come from courtiers or clerks who knew nothing of timber. It came from other shipwrights, men who had spent their own lives learning exactly where a hull's strength runs out. If you had walked the yards of the Thames that season, you would have heard it in the low voices behind the stacked timber, the kind of talk men have when they think the person in charge cannot hear them, though of course Pett could. A ship built this tall, this heavily armed, this deeply carved along every surface, was not simply a bigger version of what had come before. Every additional foot of height above the waterline was a foot of instability waiting to be proven wrong in a strong wind. Every extra gun was extra weight sitting high on a hull that had to remain somehow balanced enough not to roll herself under. The naval officers who would eventually have to sail her were, by several accounts, no less uneasy than the carpenters who had to build her. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to the men who will actually be aboard when a theory gets tested at sea, and you can imagine how thin that comfort would have felt to them, standing on a dock, watching the frame of something taller than any ship they had commanded rise above their heads. Pett, for his part, seems to have carried the doubt quietly rather than dismissing it. This is where his temperament becomes, in a way, the real subject of this part of the story. More than the king's ambition, more even than the ship itself. Charles wanted splendor delivered quickly, the way a man who has never built anything wants most things delivered, as if wanting it clearly enough were most of the work. Pett wanted the mathematics to hold. He was not a man given to bold pronouncements, and there is no surviving account of him promising the king an easy build or a fast one, or one that came without risk. What survives instead are the smaller signs of a careful mind: timber inspected and rejected, calculations revisited, a habit of testing an idea against the wood itself before testing it against the king's patience. If you have ever worked for someone whose enthusiasm outran the practical difficulty of the thing they wanted, you already know the particular tiredness in that kind of patience, and how much of it a man like Pett must have needed just to get through each visit to court without promising more than the yard could deliver. Let this next part settle over you slowly, the way it must have settled over him. The commission granted, the specifications fixed, the doubts already circling before a single frame had risen above the keel. Somewhere behind him, still unseen by the court, Gerard Christmas kept sketching, the lion taking shape a little more each week on paper, long before it would ever exist in wood. And ahead of Pett now lay the part of the work that no royal wish list could shortcut: the yard itself, the forests waiting to be felled, the long and unglamorous labor of turning a king's idea of grandeur into something that could actually be made to stand. Woolwich itself, when Pett finally rode down to see the ground where she would rise, was still mostly mud and old slipways, a working yard smelling of tar and wet rope long before it smelled of anything royal. He walked it the way you might walk a room you already knew you would have to rearrange entirely, measuring distances with his eyes rather than a rod, deciding where the keel blocks would have to sit for a hull with no precedent to measure against. The existing slip had raised ships for 2 reigns without complaint, and none of them had asked what this one would ask of it. That was a problem for later weeks, though even now you can feel it sitting at the edge of his attention, the way a held breath sits at the edge of a sentence. For the moment, there was only the walking, the counting of what timber already lay seasoning in the yard, and the far larger question of what did not yet exist at all. Forests somewhere beyond the Thames were still standing, unaware that a king's vanity had already marked them, and it would fall to other men entirely to go and find them. You do not need to know their names to feel what they were sent to do. Somewhere beyond the tide flats of the Thames, in shires that had never given a king's ship a second thought, men on horseback were riding out with instructions to look up. Not at the young trees, not at the ordinary stands that fed the sawmills every year without complaint, but at the old ones, the wide-crowned oaks that had been left alone for a reason, grown thick and knotted in a shape no other use could want. Shipwrights measured a tree the way a tailor measures a body, walking around it, sighting along its curve, imagining where a keel or a futtock or a knee might already be waiting inside the grain. If you had stood beside one of those surveyors in the wet grass of a Kentish or Sussex wood, you would have seen him go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with arithmetic, counting how many such trees a hull this size would actually need and feeling the number grow heavier the longer he stood there. The felling itself was slow, unglamorous work, done by men whose whole trade was reading a tree's lean before the first cut went in, so that when it finally came down it fell where it was told to and not across the backs of the crew beneath it. You would have heard it before you saw it. The flat chop of axes settling into a rhythm, then a silence that stretched a beat too long, then the long, tearing groan as the crown gave way and the whole tree seemed to hesitate before it committed to the ground. Multiply that morning by however many oaks the yard's demands required, spread across forests separated by days of travel, and the felling alone becomes less a single event than a slow, scattered season of falling trees that the surrounding villages must have grown used to hearing, the way one grows used to distant thunder. Getting the timber out of the woods was its own labor, and a harder one in some ways than the cutting. Oxen and horses hauled trunks along tracks that had never been built for that kind of weight, down to whatever river or creek could float them onward, where they were lashed into rafts or loaded onto barges bound eventually for the Thames. You can picture the mud of it more easily than the glory, wheels sinking to the axle, drivers cursing in the low, patient way of men who know shouting will not move a load, an ox cannot. Whole days spent covering the kind of distance a rider alone could manage before breakfast. And once the timber reached Woolwich, it did not simply become a ship. It had to wait. Oak seasons on its own clock, not a king's, and green wood worked into a hull too soon will warp, split, and betray every plank around it within a few short years. Some of what went into this ship had been resting in the yard for a long time already, laid in stacks with air gaps between the trunks, so the wind could reach every side of them, turning slowly the way meat turns on a spit, asking nothing of anyone but time. That patience needed feeding, and feeding hundreds of men is its own kind of shipbuilding. Woolwich in those months was less a dockyard than a small unplanned town, carpenters and sawyers, caulkers and blacksmiths, and behind them the men and women whose work never appears in any ledger of a ship's construction. The ones who carried water across the yard all day, who kept the cook fires going for crews too tired to walk home, who mended the same worn rope-soled shoes over and over because there was no time to make new ones. History kept none of their names, which is only fitting since there were far too many of them for any one name to stand in for the rest. If you walked the lanes between the timber stacks in the evening, you would have smelled wood smoke and pitch and boiling tar all mixed together and heard, under the hammering, the ordinary sounds of a camp settling for the night. Men bartering for ale, someone singing badly, the particular quiet of people too tired to argue. But wood doesn't answer to a king's calendar, and that was the difficulty nobody at court seemed prepared to hear. What happens then when a ship's timeline is set by a man who has never had to wait for anything to season? The man standing between those two demands was Phineas Pett. And if you have been with this story from its earlier hours, you will already know the shape of him. A shipwright grown old enough in the trade to have built for 2 reigns without ever having been asked for something like this. It fell to him to translate the king's impatience into a schedule the yard could actually survive, and to translate the yard's patience back into something the king could hear without feeling insulted by it. He had spent a working lifetime learning that a hull rushed too early is a hull that fails at sea years later, quietly, far from land, when there is no one left to blame for it. That knowledge did not make him bold in the king's presence. It made him careful, the way a man is careful when he is the only one in the room who understands exactly how much can go wrong. You do not have to remember any of these names to feel the story moving forward. They are only here to keep you company while it does. It was around this time that the first real signs of cost trouble began to surface, quietly in the way such things always begin, a request for more timber than the original estimate had allowed, a longer list of ironwork than anyone had first priced, a growing awareness among the men who kept the yard's accounts that the sums agreed upon at the start of the project bore less and less relation to what the project actually seemed to want. No one raised an alarm yet. It was too early for alarm, and besides, alarm was not a thing easily raised in front of a king who had already decided what his ship would be. But the pattern was there for anyone willing to look at it plainly. A build whose appetite kept outgrowing its budget, in a kingdom whose ordinary channels for raising money had already been closed off by the king's own hand. That was a debt being quietly assembled in the background of every cheerful report sent up from Woolwich, and it would not stay quiet forever. For now, though, the yard had a simpler kind of progress to show, the kind you could actually stand and look at. The keel was laid at last, the long spine of the ship set down along the slipway, straight as a drawn line, the single piece from which every curve of the hull would eventually be measured. And around it slowly the first ribs began to rise, great curved timbers lifted into place one after another until the skeleton of something enormous started to stand up out of the mud, its shape just barely readable against the sky. If you had come to the yard that week, that is what would have stopped you. Not a finished ship, not yet, but the sight of a shape too large to be anything but deliberate, rising a little further every day the weather allowed, waiting for the rest of itself to arrive. Even a skeleton needs watching, and Pet was there most mornings before the sawyers, walking the length of the slipway with a lantern still lit against the early dark, running a hand along a rib to feel for any give in the joint that his eye might have missed. He was not alone in that habit. A master caulker who had worked under him on 2 earlier ships had taken to arriving just as early, for reasons he never quite explained beyond a shrug and a mutter about wanting to see a thing done right before the yard woke up and started arguing about it. Between them, a kind of unspoken partnership had formed, the sort that gets no mention in any account of the ship, but without which no rib would have sat true and no plank would have closed clean against another. Above them, the frame kept climbing, one curved timber at a time until it had risen higher than the sheds around it, high enough that a man standing at its foot had to tip his whole head back to see where the topmost rib still waited to be set. You would have felt it before you understood it, standing at the foot of that rising frame, a kind of held breath in the whole yard, as if everyone from the sawyers to the caulkers had privately agreed not to say aloud what they were all thinking. No one in England had built a ship with 3 full decks of guns stacked one above the other, not like this, not so squarely announced as an intention from the very first drawing. 2 decks of guns were common enough, familiar to any shipwright who had learned his trade watching his father loft a frame. But a 3rd deck, laid on top of the other 2, run the length of the hull and packed with more ordnance than any king had yet dared to put to sea in one vessel, that had no English precedent to lean on, no half-remembered lesson from an older man's apprenticeship to fall back upon when the numbers stopped adding up cleanly on the slate. You can imagine what that absence of precedent felt like from the inside, if you have ever tried to build something for which no one before you left a set of instructions. Every previous English warship, however large, had been in some sense an argument with a ship that came before it, a little bigger here, a little different there, but always answerable to a known shape. This hull answered to nothing. Phineas Pett was drawing lines that existed nowhere else, and doing the arithmetic of buoyancy and ballast and the sheer creeping weight of iron ordnance mounted higher and higher above the waterline, with no finished ship anywhere in the kingdom he could walk out to and simply look at for reassurance. It is worth pausing here, gently, on what that kind of uncertainty does to a man's sleep. Not unlike your own, perhaps, lying in the dark, turning a decision over and over, unable to set it down. Pett had built ships his whole working life, had been raised in yards the way other boys are raised in fields or in shops, and he understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how much could go wrong when a hull's center of gravity crept upward. A ship top-heavy with her own guns does not announce her fault in the yard, on the stocks, in the calm of a river. She announces it at sea, in a wind that catches her broadside, when she leans further than a hull should lean and does not come back. And there were whispers, quiet ones, the kind that never make it into a formal report, but slip instead into private letters and the recollections of men who had watched other ships built and other ships lost. Contemporaries doubted her, not loudly, not in a way that reached the king's ear in any form he would have tolerated, but in the low, professional murmuring of men who had spent decades reading hulls the way other men read faces, and who looked at the plans for 3 gun decks, stacked one above another, and felt something tighten in their chest that had nothing to do with admiration. Too much weight too high, some of them said, in effect, if not always in those exact words. A ship built for splendor first and seaworthiness second, built to be looked at from the riverbank rather than sailed hard in a gale. You would have heard none of this from the king himself, and that is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet space between one thought and the next, the way you might sit with a half-remembered dream before it slips away entirely. Charles wanted his ship enormous, wanted her to carry more guns than any vessel afloat, wanted the whole of Europe's ambassadors to report home that England had built something without match. He was not an engineer, and he did not much need to be one, because the confidence a king projects is a different instrument from the confidence a shipwright privately holds. And it is that gap between the two, the space where royal certainty meets a craftsman's private math, where this section of the story actually lives. If your eyes have already begun to close, that is exactly the right thing to be doing right now. None of this needs to be held onto. None of it will be asked of you later. Just let the yard keep working somewhere at the edge of your hearing, the way it kept working at the edge of everyone's hearing that year, whether or not the doubts were ever spoken above a murmur. So how does a man solve a problem that no one before him has ever had to solve, with a king waiting at the other end of the answer, and no ship in the whole of the kingdom he can simply walk out and stand beside? That was the question sitting on Phineas Pett's desk through most of that build, though of course no one wrote it down in those words. What survives instead is the residue of the answer, adjustments made to the plans, alterations to the run of the hull, changes in the disposition of ballast and the placing of the lower guns, the sort of quiet correction a careful man makes again and again when he does not entirely trust his first calculation to hold. Pett had learned shipbuilding as his father had practiced it, in a family whose name was already stitched into the record of English naval construction, and that inheritance gave him a vocabulary for the ordinary problems of hull and rig. But an ordinary vocabulary only carries a man so far into an extraordinary problem, and by every account the strain of designing past the edge of established practice sat on him more heavily than the king, cheerful and impatient in his palace upriver, could easily have guessed. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that position, and you may know a version of it yourself in whatever quiet hour first taught you what it is to carry a decision that no one else can carry for you. Pett had assistants, had the yard's whole apparatus of sawyers and caulkers and riggers around him, had even, if the partnership hinted at earlier in this story is any guide, at least one trusted foreman willing to walk the frame with him before the rest of the yard woke to argue about it. But the calculations themselves, the balance of a third gun deck against a keel that had never been asked to carry one, the question of whether this particular hull at this particular height would meet a hard sea and come back level or meet it and simply keep going. Those numbers belonged to him alone in the way that certain kinds of responsibility never really divide, no matter how many hands are working around you. What he did, so far as the record allows anyone now to reconstruct it, was adjust rather than abandon. The design held its third tier of guns, held its unprecedented height above the water, because the king's ambition was not a thing to be argued down, and Pett was, after all, the king's servant before he was anyone's cautious craftsman. But within that fixed ambition, he made the small, unglamorous corrections that a worried man makes when grand vision and private doubt are forced to share the same drawing. A shift here in how the weight was carried low in the hull, a change there in the proportion of one deck to another, the sort of quiet, compensating math that never appears in a state portrait of a king admiring his new ship, but without which the whole vast experiment might have answered every one of those murmured doubts in the worst possible way, on the worst possible sea. You are not required to hold any of these figures in your mind, no more than Pet could hold every variable in his at once, and that, in its way, is the whole point of what was happening in that yard through those long, uncertain months. It was ambition on the one side and caution on the other, wearing two entirely different faces, the king's, bright and untroubled, and turned toward the future glory of the thing. And the shipwrights turned down toward the drawing table, adjusting one more time and one more time after that. Nothing about the hull's outward appearance yet gave any hint of this tension. What it needed now, once the frame itself had been coaxed into a shape Pet could finally trust, was precisely the kind of outward appearance that hides tension altogether. The gold, the carving, the color that would soon be laid across every visible surface of a ship whose bones, underneath all that splendor, had been argued over in near silence by a handful of men who understood exactly how much was riding on getting the argument right. You would have found the workshop before you found the ship, if you had come to Woolwich in those months by scent rather than sight. It sat back from the slipway in a low timber building thick with sawdust and beeswax, and if you had pushed open its door you would have walked into a forest of unfinished gods. Lions half emerged from oak blocks, a crowned figure with no face yet. Coils of acanthus leaf stacked against the wall like firewood, waiting for someone to decide where they belonged. This was Gerard Christmas's domain, and though the frame of the ship outside had been argued over by shipwrights who trusted arithmetic more than allegory, nothing that happened in here answered to arithmetic at all. Christmas was not a shipwright. He was a carver, the king's own, a master of the kind of decorative work that usually went into funeral monuments and civic pageants, rather than the sides of warships, and it tells you something about what this vessel was actually for that a man like him was given a commission on this scale. His workshop, staffed by his sons and by carvers whose names the records mostly declined to keep, had been set the task of covering nearly every visible surface of the hull in figures drawn from myth, scripture, and the king's own idea of himself. You do not need to remember any of their names to feel the weight of what they were building. It is enough to picture the shavings underfoot, thick as snow by the end of a working day, and the slow accumulation of a face out of a shapeless block that had arrived at the yard as nothing more than a length of good oak. The design itself had come down from above, sketched out by court artists before a single chisel touched the wood, and what it called for was less a ship's decoration than a full statement of royal philosophy rendered in 3 dimensions. At the bow, where a lesser ship might have carried a simple beakhead, this one carried King Edgar himself, mounted, trampling 7 kneeling kings beneath his horse's hooves. A piece of ancient, half-legendary history reached back into specifically because it gave England a claim to have ruled these waters long before any Dutch or French fleet thought to contest them. You would have had to tilt your head right back to take in the whole figure, and even then the scale of it would have seemed to argue with the modest little rowboats bobbing at anchor nearby, as though 2 different orders of reality had been moored side by side. Behind Edgar came the rest of the argument, spread across every frieze and cove and taffrail the hull possessed. Cupid astride a lion, meant to say that love could tame even ferocity. The 9 worthies, rendered along the upper works, offering a kind of moral lineage running from ancient heroes down to the king who now, by implication, joined their number. Figures representing peace and plenty stood near the stern, and above them, Fame herself, trumpet raised, as though the ship's own decoration was already announcing its arrival before it had ever left the river. None of it was subtle, and none of it was meant to be. A warship's guns could argue for a kingdom's strength in the language of iron. This one had decided to argue for it in gold leaf as well, and the 2 languages were meant to be heard together. The gilding itself deserves a slower look, because it is easy to miss what an extraordinary labor it was simply to make something shine. Gold leaf arrived at the yard beaten thinner than paper, sheets so fragile that a careless breath could destroy one, and it had to be laid by hand over a ground of red bole that gave the metal its warmth once burnished. If you had stood close enough on a still afternoon, you might have watched a gilder work in near silence, breathing carefully away from his own hands, pressing leaf after leaf onto a carved wave or a lion's mane until the whole figure seemed to hold its own private daylight even under grey skies. There is nothing you need to hold on to here beyond that image. A man's careful, unhurried hands laying brightness onto a hull that had been built, at its heart, for war. What the design was ultimately saying, taken as a whole, was simple enough that even a passing waterman could read it without knowing a single classical reference by name. Here was a king who ruled by ancient right, favoured by love and peace and plenty, remembered by fame, and answerable, in the end, to no one but the crown he wore. It was a striking case to make in gold on a hull, and it would have been a stirring one too if the king making it had not been, at that very moment, ruling a kingdom with no parliament sitting to argue back. But who, you might quietly wonder, actually pays for a king to say something like that in gold leaf across the length of a warship? The answer reached almost every household on the English coast before the ship herself was finished, and it did not arrive as gently as the gilders' hands laid their leaf. The vessel's final cost ran to something in the neighbourhood of £65,000, a sum so far beyond anything spent on an English warship before her that officials struggled even to present it plainly in the accounts, and one that had nothing to do with hulls or masts or guns at all, once you set the shipwrights' bill aside. A meaningful share of it, by some estimates close to a third, had gone into carving and gold, into Christmas's workshop and the gilders' careful hands, into Cupid and his lion and King Edgar's 7 kneeling captives. It was, by any measure available to the age, an almost unthinkable amount of money spent on the look of a thing rather than its function. And it had come, nearly all of it, from ship money, the very levy that had let Charles build a navy without ever asking a parliament's leave for it. Coastal towns that had never seen this vessel and mostly never would were assessed their share regardless. Fishing villages and small ports whose entire annual trade might not equal the price of a single gilded frieze on her stern. You can imagine, if you let yourself sit with it a moment in the dark, what it must have felt like to receive a demand for money to help finish a ship you would likely never lay eyes on, built to carry the image of a king trampling other kings underfoot, while your own harbour silted and your own boats went unrepaired. Resentment of that kind rarely shows up neatly in a single document. It shows up scattered, in the refusals recorded in country assize rolls, in the slow, grinding arguments over who owed what and why, in the quiet erosion of the very trust the ship had been built to display. The men who administered the levy understood well enough that the ship's beauty was doing real political work, whatever its cost. A vessel this magnificent was meant to be self-evidently worth what it demanded, its splendor serving as its own argument for the tax that paid for it. But an argument made only in gold leaf convinces less readily than one made in Parliament, and by the time the last figures went up along her upper works, the resentment travelling back down the coast toward London was already as real, in its own quiet way, as the ship herself. None of that discontent showed on the hull. If you had walked the yard in her final weeks of finishing, past Christmas's workshop now nearly emptied of its unfinished gods, you would have seen only the completed result, Edgar and his kneeling kings catching the low winter light, fame's trumpet gleaming above the stern, the whole vast surface glowing gold wherever the sun reached it and dulling to a deep, patient bronze wherever it did not. She looked, by every account that survives, like nothing else that had ever floated on the Thames. What she did not yet have, for all that gold, was any proof at all that she could actually go to sea. The carving was finished, the gilding was finished, the argument in wood and metal had been made in full. The argument in water, whether a hull this heavy, this tall, this laden with ornament above the waterline could be trusted to stand upright once she left the calm of her own slipway, had not yet begun, and it was waiting for her now with considerably less patience than the carvers had shown. The launch had been fixed for a morning in the autumn of 1637, though anyone who tells you the date with total confidence is smoothing over what the yard itself felt at the time, which was less like certainty and more like a held breath. A slipway is not simply a ramp. It is a calculation built months before the hull it will carry even exists, and it has to guess correctly at a weight that does not exist yet either. The men at Woolwich had built slipways before. They had never built one for anything like this. You can imagine? No, better, you can feel it if you let yourself stand where they stood. The particular unease of finishing a piece of engineering and then simply having to trust it, because there was no way to test a launching cradle except by launching something on it, and the something in this case was the most expensive object the yard had ever produced. Phineas Pett had spent the better part of 3 years answering for this ship in front of men who outranked him and understood wood far less than he did. He had answered for the timber. He had answered for the guns, the gilding, the swelling cost that kept climbing past what anyone in Whitehall wanted written down. Launch day asked him to answer for something else entirely, something that could not be argued or accounted for after the fact, because it would either happen correctly in front of everyone or it would not happen at all, and there is no version of a failed launch that stays quiet. A cracked slipway, a hull that stuck fast, a keel that split under its own weight the moment the chocks came away, any of these would have been witnessed by exactly the sort of people whose good opinion Pett needed to keep. You do not get to try a launch twice with the same dignity. The tides had been read with a care that bordered on devotion. The Thames at Woolwich is not a gentle, obedient river. It rises and falls with a rhythm that shipwrights had learned to respect long before Pett was born. And a launch pointed at the wrong hour could leave a hull grounded in mud within sight of the water it was meant to be floating on. So the calculations were checked, and checked again, against a hull whose true weight nobody could give with real confidence, because nothing this heavy, dressed in this much gilding and carrying this much ordnance above the waterline, had gone down an English slipway before. Pett was, by his own account and by the account of those who wrote about him afterward, a careful man made more careful by fear. Not a dramatic fear, nothing that would have shown on his face if you had stood beside him that morning, but the low, constant kind that a man carries when he knows that the next few minutes will decide how the rest of his life is remembered. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no measurement you have to keep in your head. It is enough to picture the yard in the grey hour before the tide was right. Ropes coiled and checked one more time out of habit rather than need, timber greased along the ways, men stationed at intervals along the hull's flank with instructions they had gone over more than once, and Pett himself moving along the slipway, not because there was anything left for him to do with his hands, but because standing still was worse. But how exactly does anyone move something this heavy without either breaking the thing itself or breaking the men trying to guide it downhill into a river? The answer the age had settled on was gravity, patience, and an enormous amount of grease. The slipway ran downward at a shallow, deliberate slope, greased along its length with tallow so the hull's own weight would carry her, once released, without needing to be pushed. Chocks and props held her in place until the tide reached the height the calculations called for, and the removing of those props was not a single dramatic gesture but a sequence, worked through point by point, each one taken away only when the men responsible were satisfied the hull would not simply drop. If you had been standing at the base of the ways that morning, the sound reaching you first would not have been a roar but a series of small, ordinary noises, mallets, low voices giving instruction, the creak of timber settling by fractions, each one meaning that the ship, for the first time in her existence, was being asked to move on her own. And then, in that grey light, she did. The accounts that survive describe it the way you might describe watching something enormous discover, almost gently, that it is no longer standing on land. There was no explosion of movement. There was a shift, a groan along the keel that every man on that slipway had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. And then a slow, gathering slide, gold, catching what little sun there was as the hull went from stillness into motion, the whole vast painted weight of her sliding down the greased ways toward water that had never held anything like her. She struck the Thames not with violence, but with a kind of settling. The enormous displacement she caused rolling outward from her in slow waves that reached the banks and the boats moored there well after the hull herself had gone still, riding, astonishingly, upright. You would have heard the crowd before you understood what they were reacting to. Word of the ship had travelled well beyond Woolwich long before that morning. The cost of her had made sure of that, if nothing else. and the banks were lined with people who had come simply to see whether the stories were true, whether a ship really could be that large, that gilded, that expensive, and still float the way an ordinary vessel floats. There is something almost tender about a crowd gathered for a spectacle it half suspects will fail. The murmurs that survive in the record are murmurs of both things at once: awe at the sheer painted mass of her riding the water, and a lingering unspoken doubt that a hull carrying this much decoration so far above her waterline could possibly behave the way a warship needed to behave once real weather and real waves came looking for her. Gilding does not make a ship stable. Everyone on that riverbank knew it, even as they admired it. Phineas Pett, by every account, allowed himself very little relief even once she was afloat. A successful launch answers only one question: whether the ship can leave land without destroying herself in the attempt, and it leaves every other question about her exactly where it was. If your eyes are already growing heavy, let this next part settle over you slowly rather than trying to hold on to it. The ship that evening rode at her mooring on the Thames, complete in almost every visible sense: gold-catching torchlight instead of sun, her decks finished, her carving finished, her guns not yet loaded, and her sails not yet bent to the yards. She was, for the first time, unmistakably a ship rather than a construction site. And she was, for exactly that reason, about to be asked questions that no slipway, no calculation of tides, and no amount of careful grease could answer for her. Questions that only the open water and the weather that came with it would ever be able to settle. For now, though, she simply sat there, tethered by lines that seemed almost modest against the bulk they were holding, and the yard around her began the slow work of exhaling. Men who had spent the morning rigid with attention found themselves, by evening, laughing too loudly at small things, the way people do when a danger has passed and the body has not quite caught up with the news. Pett walked her decks once more before the light went, not inspecting so much as simply looking, the way a man looks at something he has carried for years and is only now allowed to see finished. You would have noticed, if you had been beside him, that he touched very little. There is a particular way careful men behave around the things they have finally stopped being afraid of losing. But a hull riding empty at her mooring is not yet a warship, and everyone on that river knew it. The guns that would give her weight and purpose were still stacked and waiting elsewhere. The sails that would give her motion were still folded in a loft, and the true test of what all that gold and oak could actually withstand had not even begun to arrive. You would have needed to walk her length twice before your eye adjusted to the fact that this was one ship and not some floating street. The hull that had seemed so improbable on the stocks, so much larger than the yard that held it, had not shrunk at all now that it was finished and sitting in the water where it belonged. If anything, it had grown, the way a face you have only seen in portraits seems to widen and deepen when you finally stand in front of it. 3 tiers of gun ports ran along her side in even black rows, and above them, the upper works rose in their own smaller stories, deck stacked on deck, each one a little narrower than the one below, so that from a distance she had the shape of a fortress that had somehow decided to go to sea. You would have had to tip your head back to find the top of her masts, and then tip it back further still because the rigging kept climbing past the point where your neck wanted to stop. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no measurement worth keeping awake for. Only the shape of the thing, settling slowly into your mind the way it settled into the eyes of everyone on that river who had never seen an English ship built on this scale before. The gun decks were where the ship stopped being an idea and became an argument. She carried more cannon than any vessel the country had yet put to sea, ranked along 3 whole decks instead of the usual 2, an arrangement that had made her hull thicker and her keel deeper, and had cost the yard more sleepless argument than almost anything else in her design. Rows of them stood along each deck in the grey light that came through the ports, iron barrels resting on their carriages, tackle coiled beside them, the whole arrangement repeating itself deck after deck, until the mind lost count somewhere in the 2nd tier and simply accepted that there were a great many, more than seemed reasonable for one hull to hold upright. Between the decks, the air already smelled of pitch, That thick, warm, resinous smell that had followed the ship since her first plank was corked, mixed now with something sharper underneath it, the first faint bitterness of powder that had been carried aboard in barrels and stored below in the dark. It is a smell that does not leave a ship once it arrives, and if you had walked those decks in the weeks after she was finished, it would have been the smell you carried home in your coat without meaning to. The new timber still creaked in a way that old timber does not. A high, searching sound overhead as the upper work settled and dried, as if the ship were talking quietly to herself in a language only carpenters understood. Officers walking the decks would pause sometimes at a particular groan from the beams above, listening the way a doctor listens to a chest before deciding it was nothing and walking on. Everyone aboard a new ship learns, eventually, which sounds belong to her and which do not. Alongside her, ordinary vessels looked like toys set out on a pond. A merchant hoy or a fishing smack tying up nearby would find itself dwarfed so completely that its own crew sometimes stopped their work simply to stare upward, the way you might stop on a city street to look at a building whose top floor you cannot see from the pavement. Watermen who had rowed that stretch of the Thames their whole lives found themselves rowing wide of her without quite deciding to, the way small boats naturally give room to something that could crush them without noticing. Phineas Pett had walked those same decks countless times by then, first as their builder and now increasingly as their custodian, and those who watched him move through the completed ship said he had a particular way of pausing at each gun deck threshold before stepping through, as though counting something silently to himself. He had spent the better part of 2 years worrying this hull into existence, and a man does not simply stop worrying the day the worrying is supposed to be finished. He would trail a hand along a beam here, test a hatch cover there, the small proprietary gestures of someone who had earned the right to touch what he had made, even now that the king's officers and gunners had begun to treat the ship as theirs. But what was it actually like to be one of the men who would live inside all that oak and iron, to call these decks home rather than simply admire them from a passing boat? Among the crews being assembled to serve her was a young gunner, one of the hundreds of ordinary seamen whose names the records never troubled to keep. A man drawn from the pool of trained hands the Navy always needed and rarely paid enough to satisfy. He would have come aboard in those first weeks the way most of his kind did, carrying almost nothing, expecting to sleep wherever a hammock could be slung between the beams, and finding instead that this particular ship offered rather less headroom than its size from the outside had led him to imagine. The lower gun deck, for all its grandeur in gilt and paint above the waterline, was still a working space of low beams and coiled rope, and the permanent half-darkness that came from ports that were, for most of a voyage, kept shut against the sea. He would have learned his gun the way every gunner learned his gun, by handling it in the dark until his hands knew its weight without his eyes needing to check, by learning which of the ropes controlling its recoil answered quickly and which had a habit of jamming, by memorizing the particular creak of the deck beneath his feet that told him the tide had turned before anyone above decks announced it. A ship of this size, carrying cannon in numbers no English yard had attempted before, meant more of everything for men like him. More powder to be carried and stowed with the particular caution powder always demanded, more crew packed into decks that had not grown any taller for having grown so much longer, more voices and more boots and more of the low, constant undertone of a large crew living in a confined wooden world. If you had stood beside him on that gun deck in those first weeks, you might have noticed how quickly the strangeness wore off, how a space that had seemed impossibly grand from a visitor's rowboat became, from the inside, simply the place where a man ate and slept and worked. No more remarkable to him after a fortnight than any other ship he had served in. Only louder, only larger, only carrying a good deal more iron than he had grown used to trusting his life beside. What that number of guns meant, beyond the raw fact of it, was a statement about what this ship was for. She was not built simply to carry a court's ambitions gently across a harbor on a calm afternoon. She was built to be the most heavily armed thing afloat under an English flag, capable of meeting anything a rival kingdom might send against her and outmatching it, gun for gun. That purpose sat inside her hull as plainly as her gilding sat upon her stern, two intentions folded into one ship, the desire to dazzle and the desire to dominate, each one making the other seem, depending on who you asked, either entirely justified or entirely absurd. All of that, though, was still theory. A ship with her ports full of cannon and her decks full of men is still only a promise until the sea itself is allowed to test her, and the sea, as everyone aboard already understood, keeps its own opinions about how much gold and oak a hull can carry before something has to give. Above the waterline, where the gunner's world gave way to the part of the ship built for looking at rather than fighting from, the brass began. Lanterns and fittings along the quarterdeck had been cast and polished until they held the light like small captured suns, and the rails themselves, wherever a hand might rest, carried carving too fine for a working ship, vines and figures twisting into one another in patterns a passing waterman could never hope to count from the river below. It was here, climbing from the low dark of the gun decks into that brightness, that a man began to understand the other half of what he served. The brass and the carving belonged to the part of the ship that photographed well, so to speak, long before photographs existed, the part that flattered a king and drew a crowd to the riverbank. But wood and iron do not care how they are admired. Somewhere below all that gilding, the ship still had to behave like a ship, and it was on the water, away from the yard and its crowds, that the truth of her began to surface. You would have felt it first as a kind of reluctance. Sovereign of the seas did not tip and right herself the way a smaller vessel does, quick and almost cheerful about it. She leaned, and she held the lean, and she took her time coming back, as though she were considering the matter. Stand on her deck in anything more than a gentle swell, and your knees would have told you what the shipwrights already suspected and had mostly kept to themselves, that a hull carrying that much castle work above the waterline, that many decks of guns stacked higher than any English ship had stacked them before, was not going to sit on the sea the way a lower, leaner vessel sat on it. She was proud in the water in the same way she was proud at anchor, which is to say, she stood tall, and standing tall has a cost that only becomes obvious once the wind picks up. Officers who took her out on those early trials wrote what officers write, which is to say carefully, in the language of concern rather than complaint, because complaining about the king's own ship was not a habit that ended careers gently. But the language of concern is still legible centuries later if you know how to read it, and what it says again and again is that she was a difficult ship to fight in anything but calm water. She rolled heavily. She was slow to answer her helm. In a following sea, she behaved in ways that made experienced sailors reach for the rail. None of this made her a failure, not yet. Plenty of great ships of that age had their quirks and were sailed around them for decades. But it did mean that the thing everyone had feared quietly during the building and no one had said aloud while the king was watching turned out to be true the moment she left the calm of the Thames for open water. You do not need to hold on to any of these details to follow the rest of the story. They only matter here as the sound of a private worry becoming a public one, and that sound was Phineas Pett's to hear most of all. He had built ships his whole working life, had built them for this king's father, had defended his own honesty and his own workmanship before a royal commission when accusations of corner-cutting threatened to end him, and had come through that inquiry with his name more or less intact. Now here was a different kind of scrutiny, quieter than a formal commission, but in some ways harder to answer, because it was not about whether he had cheated the crown on timber or nails. It was about a judgment he had made in good faith, the judgment that this hull could carry 3 full tiers of guns and the ornament the king wanted above them, and still be a ship a captain could trust in weather. The evidence rolling under men's feet on the open sea was not proof that Pett had lied. It was proof that ambition, however honestly built, has a ceiling, and that this particular ship had been asked to live somewhere near it. Other shipwrights had opinions, as shipwrights always do about a colleague's work, and some of those opinions found their way into the arguments that followed, mutterings that the upper works were too heavy for the depth of hold beneath them, that a lower profile would have served the king's navy better than a taller one served his vanity. It was not a united chorus against Pett so much as a scattering of men who had warned in one form or another that height above the water has to be paid for somewhere below it, and who now felt entitled to say so a little louder. But what do you do with a ship already built, already gilded, already loved by a king, once the sea itself has quietly disagreed with her design? You do not tear her apart and start again. No treasury in Europe, however creative its taxation, would have survived that. What you do instead is trim the thing that can still be trimmed without touching the hull that has already been shaped and closed and painted. For Sovereign of the Seas, that meant her guns. She had gone to sea carrying an extraordinary weight of ordnance across those 3 tiers, more cannon than almost any ship afloat, and in the years that followed her early trials, her armament was reduced, not dramatically, not in a single stroke that anyone announced with fanfare, but steadily, gun by gun, as successive refits found reasons to lighten what sat highest and heaviest above her waterline. It was never described, in the records that survive, as an admission that the design had failed. It was described, when it was described at all, in the practical language of seaworthiness and handling, the same careful language the trial reports had used. But you do not need the word failure spoken aloud to recognize what the decision meant. A ship built to carry more guns than any English vessel before her was, within a handful of years of her launch, carrying fewer, because the sea had made its preference known and even a king's shipwright had to listen eventually. If your eyes are already closing, let this next part settle over you slowly, because none of it is urgent. It is only a small human contradiction, the kind history is full of. While his admirals and his shipwrights were making these quiet adjustments below the level of royal notice, Charles I himself never once, in anything the record shows, wavered in his pride over the ship. He had commissioned a vessel meant to declare something about his reign to every foreign court that saw her, and as far as the public record is concerned, she went on declaring it. She appears in the correspondence and the accounts of the period as an object of continued royal favor, held up as evidence of the strength and majesty of his navy at the very moment his navy's own officers were writing careful notes about her rolling in a swell. It is not hard to imagine why. A king does not commission the most expensive warship of the age and then announce to visiting ambassadors that she has trouble in a following sea. The gap between what Charles said about his ship and what his officers wrote about her in their trial reports is one of the quieter, stranger details in the whole story. The same vessel, praised in one room as the pride of England and quietly managed in another as a ship that needed watching. And Charles was hardly alone in that particular gap between ambition and water. Across the channel and beyond it, other courts were chasing the same impossible arithmetic: more guns, more gilding, more height above the waterline, all of it stacked onto hulls that still had to float and turn and answer a helm in weather no artist ever painted. France would try her own version of the contest before the century was out. The Dutch, more practical by temperament and by trade, would mostly resist it, building lower and leaner ships that could actually be sailed the way their admirals wanted. Sovereign of the Seas was not an isolated vanity, in other words, but an early and unusually visible entry in a much longer competition, one where kings kept discovering, ship by ship, decade by decade, exactly how much splendor the sea was willing to carry before it began, quietly and without malice, to disagree. That contest would keep costing kings money for another century, but Sovereign of the Seas had already made its own quiet contribution to the ledger. Somewhere in the region of £40,000 had gone into her by the time the shipwrights finished trimming what could be trimmed, a sum that made ship money feel less like an abstraction and more like a debt owed by every coastal parish in the kingdom. Charles never spoke of the figure. His officers, still writing their careful reports, understood it rather better than he did. His officers, still writing their careful reports, understood it rather better than he did. Step back far enough, though, and Sovereign of the Seas stops looking like a single king's extravagance and starts looking like one move in a much longer game, one being played across every court in Europe that could still afford a shipyard. You would not have needed to travel far from the Thames to find someone else chasing the same impossible shape. Go south to the arsenal at Toulon, or east to the shipyards along the Dutch coast, and you would have found the same conversations happening in different languages, the same arguments about how many guns a hull could carry before the sea itself objected. This was not England alone deciding that bigger meant safer or bigger meant grander. It was a shared fever, and it had been building for the better part of a century before Phineas Pett ever cut a line into oak at Woolwich. If your eyes have already closed, let this next part settle over you slowly, because none of it needs remembering, only feeling. The sense of a whole continent leaning the same direction at once. In Sweden, a few years before Sovereign was laid down, a king named Gustavus Adolphus had ordered a warship of his own, tall and heavily gunned and richly carved. A vessel meant to announce Swedish power on waters where Sweden had never before been taken seriously. That ship was called Vasa, and she never reached open sea at all. She sailed perhaps a mile from her berth in Stockholm harbour, caught a gust of wind, and went over, sinking within sight of the crowd that had gathered to watch her leave. Nobody in Woolwich would have known the details, not with any certainty, but word of a great ship lost to her own top-heavy pride travelled between shipyards, the way bad news always does, quietly, and usually too late to change anyone's mind. Pett would have heard some version of it. Whether he let it worry him is not something any surviving letter records. Across the Channel, France was building its own answer at almost the same moment. La Couronne, laid down for Cardinal Richelieu's navy, rose from a yard on the Atlantic coast at very nearly the scale Sovereign was reaching on the Thames, and for the same essential reason, because a chief minister wanted his fleet to be spoken of the way Sovereign was being spoken of, whispered over and measured against, a hull too large for its neighbours to ignore. You could stand at either yard, French or English, and hear roughly the same sounds. Adzes biting into timber, foremen shouting the same warnings in different tongues, the same argument, endlessly repeated, about whether the upper decks were being asked to carry more weight than good sense allowed. It was not a race with a starting gun or a finish line. It was closer to a shared appetite that had quietly taken hold of every treasury in Europe capable of feeding it, one kingdom watching another out of the corner of its eye, and refusing to be the smaller one. But was Charles's gamble truly a lonely one, dreamed up in isolation on a stretch of Thames mud? Or was he simply the English entry in a contest every major court had already entered without ever formally agreeing to it? The evidence leans hard toward the second answer. Kings measured one another in warships the way they measured one another in palaces and portraits, and a fleet that looked modest beside a rival's fleet was a kind of public humiliation no ruler wanted attached to his name. Sovereign of the seas was Charles's answer to a question no one had directly asked him, and in that sense she belonged to a lineage stretching backward through Spanish galleons built a generation earlier and forward through hulls that would not be laid down until long after Charles himself was gone. You are not really listening to the story of one ship tonight. You are listening to one long, unbroken argument that human ambition has been having with itself for centuries, conducted almost entirely in the language of oak, tar, and gold leaf. That argument did not end with Sovereign, and it did not end kindly for most of the ships that carried it forward. But something of her did survive past the wood itself, and it survived in places nobody watching her launch would have expected. Later English designers, drawing up hulls a generation after Pett's death, kept returning to Sovereign of the Seas the way a craftsman returns to an old drawing pinned to the workshop wall, not because it was perfect, but because it had already made every mistake worth learning from. The 3 full tiers of guns that had made her so difficult to trust in a swell were quietly reconsidered on later ships. Weight shifted lower, upper decks lightened, the whole silhouette made a little less proud and a little more seaworthy. You could say the safer ships that followed her were built partly out of respect and partly out of correction, the way a son sometimes builds his whole career answering the parts of his father's life that went wrong. Naval architects who never met Phineas Pett still inherited his arithmetic, his stubborn belief that a hull could be pushed further than convention allowed, softened just enough by everything Sovereign had taught them about the cost of pushing too far. And Pett himself, whatever else his long career had included, smaller ships, honest ones, ships that gave no one cause for alarm, found his name fastened permanently to this single vessel above all others. It is a strange kind of fate for a shipwright who spent decades building vessels nobody worried about. Ask any naval clerk of the following generation to name the man behind Sovereign of the Seas, and Pett's name came without hesitation. Ask them to name anything else he built, and the answer came slower, if it came at all. He had spent a lifetime earning a reputation for care and precision. And in the end, that reputation attached itself almost entirely to the one ship built specifically to ignore caution in favor of splendor. There is something almost gentle in that irony, the sort of thing you might turn over once in the dark before letting it go. None of that reckoning mattered yet, though, on the morning the gilded hull finally cleared the Nore and turned her bow toward open water for the first time as a working ship of war rather than a spectacle tied up at anchor for admiring visitors. The contest of giants she belonged to was a story for historians to untangle later, at their leisure, in rooms far from any battle. What waited for Sovereign herself now was simpler and far less abstract. Actual weather, actual enemies, and a war that cared nothing at all for how much gold had gone into her rails. The river had carried her this far without complaint, but the Nore was where rivers stopped pretending to be forgiving. You would have felt it before you saw it, the change in the water under the hull, the long swells rolling in off the estuary mouth instead of sliding past a quiet bank. Sovereign of the Seas met that first open swell the way every heavily gunned ship of her generation eventually had to, with a roll that made every man on the upper deck reach for something solid without quite admitting why. Nobody wrote down whether Pett was aboard for it. Most accounts suggest he was not, that he had already handed the ship to the officers who would sail her, the way a builder hands a house to a family and stands at the gate a moment longer than he needs to. What the crew felt that day was not fear exactly, more a kind of steady recalculation, the sort sailors make quietly and mostly to themselves. A ship this tall in the upper works asked something different of the men handling her lines than a lower, plainer vessel would have. Gun crews learned quickly which sea states let them work the lower tier at all, and which turned that tier into standing water and wasted effort. None of this appears in any surviving log as complaint. It appears, if it appears at all, as adjustment, a slightly different order given, a slightly different watch rotation, the practical grammar of men learning a new and difficult instrument. But how does a ship this expensive, this watched, this argued over before she ever left the yard, actually behave once the argument stops being about design and starts being about war? That question did not wait long for an answer. Parliament and King were already sliding toward the quarrel that would tear the country apart within a few short years, and a ship built to announce one man's authority over the seas was about to be handed, gun deck and all, to a conflict that no longer much cared whose authority it was. The war came in the way that most wars come to the people living through them, which is to say slowly, and then all at once. You would not have needed to read a proclamation to feel it. You would have felt it in the price of rope at Woolwich, in the sudden scarcity of tar, in the way men who had once argued cheerfully about rigging now lowered their voices when the King's name came up on the dockside. Charles I, who had commissioned this ship as a floating argument for his right to tax a nation without its consent, was about to lose the argument entirely, and lose considerably more than that along with it. By the time the King's cause collapsed into defeat and then into a scaffold outside Whitehall, the ship that bore his ambitions on every gilded surface of her hull had become something awkward to look at. A country that had just executed its king did not much want a warship going about with the word royal carved into her name in letters a man could read from the water, so they changed it. Not the whole ship, not her guns or her decks or the great carved lion still baring its teeth at the sea beneath her bowsprit, but her name, which is a smaller thing to alter and a stranger thing to live inside. Under the Commonwealth, she became simply sovereign. The crown quietly filed away, the word royal dropped as though it were a piece of gilding that had come loose and nobody troubled to replace. If you had stood on her deck in those years, you would have heard men still calling her by the old name out of habit, the way a family keeps using a house's former name long after new owners have moved in. Names are stubborn that way. They outlast the politics that change them. Phineas Pett was still alive to see this happen, though by now he was an old man measured against the ship he had built, his hands slower than they had been on the day her keel was laid at Woolwich. He had built her for a king who believed a hull could argue his authority into being. He lived long enough to watch that same hull carry the flag of the men who had killed that king, and there is no record of what he thought about that, no letter, No diary entry that survives to tell you whether it struck him as justice or as waste. You are not required to resolve that for him. Some things the record simply declines to answer. And this is one of the smaller mercies of history, that it does not insist you feel any particular way about every reversal it hands you. The young rigger who had once stood on her yards learning the grammar of her rigging was, by these years, no longer young. He had spent the better part of a decade with salt in his hands and this ship's canvas under his feet, one of the many whose names no muster roll troubled to keep. And if he was still aboard her when her name changed, he would have felt it the way sailors feel most political weather, which is at a distance and mostly as an inconvenience to the paperwork. The ship herself did not care what she was called. She still drew the same depth, still needed the same care against the rot that found her lower timbers, no matter how much tar was poured into them, still answered to the wind in the same unwieldy, magnificent way she always had. A name is a thing given from outside. What a ship is decided by water, and water had never once asked what a man wished to call her. But what does a warship do in the end, once the argument that built her has been settled by an axe rather than a treaty, and the country holding her no longer has a throne to defend her honor with? It sends her to war, of course, because that is the only thing a 100-gun ship is actually good for, whatever a king may have intended when he ordered the carving on her stern. Under the Commonwealth, still known as Sovereign, she took her place in the fleet actions of the First Anglo-Dutch War, in those years when England and the Dutch Republic fought one another up and down the length of the Channel and the North Sea over fishing rights and flags and the slow, bitter economics of who got to carry the world's cargo. If you had been below her gun deck during one of those engagements, you would not have seen much of the battle at all. You would have seen the man beside you, the gun in front of you, the low ceiling close enough to touch, and you would have heard everything as a single continuous weight of sound pressing down through the timbers, indistinguishable, after the first quarter hour, from the pounding in your own skull. That is what it is to fight from inside a wooden ship. The grandeur belongs to the people watching from shore. Inside, there is only smoke and heat, and the particular discipline of loading a gun again because the man beside you is already reaching for the next charge. She survived that war, as she would survive the ones that followed it, and when the monarchy came back to England in the person of Charles's own son, the ship's name came back with it, though not quite whole. She was not returned to her original grandeur of a title. She became royal sovereign now, the crown restored, but the seas quietly dropped, as though even a returning king understood that the old boast had been a young man's boast, made before anyone had learned what an axe outside a palace could do to a family's certainty about its own permanence. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this, no name or date worth gripping tightly in the dark. Let it drift past the way the ship herself drifted from one flag to another, patient, indifferent, still afloat. Under that restored name she fought again through the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars, decades now since her keel had first gone down at Woolwich, decades since Phineas Pett had stood on her ribs and called them sound. She served more than once as a flagship, an admiral's colours run up her mast where once a king's ambition had been carved into her rails. And the record that survives of those years speaks of her the way records tend to speak of ships that simply keep doing their duty without producing a memorable disaster, briefly and without much drama. She held her place in the line. She took and gave broadsides in the general grinding rhythm of 17th century naval war. Fleets of 100 sails apiece maneuvering for the wind, guns run out, smoke lying flat across the water because there was rarely enough breeze to clear it. If you searched for a single dramatic afternoon that defined her war record, you would not find one, and that absence is its own kind of fact. She was reliable in the particular, unglamorous way that expensive things are sometimes allowed to become reliable once the argument about their cost has been forgotten and only the ship is left. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that for a moment, quietly, the way you might turn over a stone in your hand without needing to do anything with it. The ship outlived the king who built her. She outlived the reason he built her. Every argument about ship money and royal prerogative and a monarch's right to tax without Parliament's consent had gone cold and settled into history books long before her hull stopped being useful at sea. And yet there she still was, decade after decade, doing the one plain thing a warship does, entirely unconcerned with whose portrait had once hung, imagined or otherwise, in the timber of her stern. Kings came and went. The ship simply floated and fought and was repaired and floated again. And somewhere on that stern, through all of it, the carvings that Gerard Christmas and his workshop had cut so many years before were still there, though you would have had to look closely to see them as they had once been. The salt air of 2 wars and 30-odd years does not treat gold leaf kindly. The lion that had once seemed almost to move in the sunlight off the Thames had gone dull at the edges, its gilding thinned by weather and worn by the hands of men climbing past it in the dark, its details softened the way a coin's face softens under enough thumbs. It was still recognizably itself. It was simply no longer new, in the way that nothing aboard her was new anymore, in the way that no ship this heavily used ever stays new, however much gold a king once poured into her to make her look as though she might. She had a great deal further left to travel yet, this old and altered ship, carrying a dead king's vanity through wars he never lived to see, and there is more of her story still ahead before the fire finally finds her. The years that came after did not arrive as history arrives in books, all at once and labelled. They arrived the way most of a ship's life arrives, in the shape of dockyard bills and carpenters' reports, in small decisions made by men who had never known her when she was new. If you had walked the wharves at Chatham or Portsmouth in one of those quieter years, you would not have seen the gilded apparition that once startled a king's own shipwrights into silence. You would have seen a warship in for repair, her paint dulled by salt, her carving chipped at the edges the way carving always chips when nobody has the money or the patience to keep touching it up. Refit followed refit. Masts were replaced when they sprang, not because a mast in poor repair was any kind of scandal, but because the sea does that to masts regardless of what a ship once cost. Timbers were shifted, sheathed, replaced piece by piece in the ordinary slow surgery that keeps any wooden hull alive past its first few decades, so that a purist standing on her deck by then might have asked, not entirely as a joke, how much of the original ship was even still there beneath him. You do not need to hold on to any of these repairs individually. No one who loved this ship kept a tally of which plank was new and which had sailed with her from the beginning, and neither should you. What matters is the shape of the pattern, which was this. Every year that passed took a little more of the ornament and left a little more of the plain necessary ship underneath it, the way a coastline takes the softness off a stone. The great stern gallery that had once carried royal virtues in carved and gilded human form went on existing, technically, but a ship that goes to war for decades cannot spend every winter re-gilding a king's allegory when the guns need bronze and the crew needs bread. Practicality does that to splendor. It does not destroy it outright. It simply stops renewing it and lets the salt finish the argument on its own schedule. Somewhere in the middle of all this, quietly, almost as a line in a much longer record rather than an event of its own, Phineas Pett died. He had built her from the beginning, had answered for every foot of her curve when the court doubted whether she would float at all, and he did not live to see the fire that would one day end her, nor even to see most of the wars she fought under her later name. His death is noted in the sources the way the deaths of working men usually are, briefly, a line among many, and there is a kind of honesty in that brevity that suits him better than a monument would have. He was not a courtier, he was a builder, and builders in his family did not stop being builders just because one of them had died. His son, Peter Pett, had already been raised inside the same trade, had learned the same angles and the same arguments about draft and stability at the same yards, and the work of the family did not end at the graveside. The Petts went on building and repairing king's ships for generations after Phineas was gone, one of those long, ordinary dynasties of skill that never gets a monument of its own, but keeps the entire navy afloat regardless. Father teaching son the exact same worry about the exact same waterline, decade after decade, so quietly that most people watching a launch never think to ask whose hands actually shaped the hull. If your eyes have already started to close somewhere in that last thought, that is exactly the right place for them to close, because none of this asks to be remembered in detail. It only asks to be felt as a kind of slow tide, one family's work outlasting one family's life, the way tides outlast any single wave. But what became of the men who had first climbed aboard her when her paint was still wet and her guns had never been fired in earnest? That is a harder question to answer, because the sources rarely follow an ordinary sailor the way they follow a master shipwright, and most of the men who served aboard her across those decades left no name behind at all. There is, though, the shape of one such life worth returning to, the same gunner glimpsed earlier in this story, one of hundreds whose names no record kept. A man who had been young enough once to be sent aloft on errands he only half understood, and who had grown old the way ships grow old without ever quite noticing the exact moment it happened. Picture him now, if you can, further along than when you first met him, his hands thicker with the particular calluses that come from years at a gun carriage rather than months, his hearing already beginning to thin at the edges the way a gunner's hearing does after enough discharges close beside his own head. He would have known this ship the way a man knows a house he has lived in far longer than he ever expected to, every creak accounted for, every superstition about her attached to some remembered voyage. Younger sailors coming aboard for the first time would have looked up at her gilded stern, worn as it was by then, and asked him whether it was true what they said about her cost, about the king who built her, about the riot she had once caused, simply by being launched. And he would have answered the way old hands always answer young ones, half proud and half weary, the pride of having been there from early on mixed with the weariness of having explained it 100 times before. She had, by this stage of her life, earned a nickname among the men who served her, an affectionate shorthand that men use for something they respect without any longer being dazzled by it. She was old, in the particular way a warship is old, which is to say, formidable still, heavily armed still, capable of frightening an enemy captain half to death across open water, and at the same time visibly a survivor of an earlier age, her lines a little unfashionable beside the newer ships being laid down around her. Younger designs were leaner by then, built with different lessons learned from different wars, and beside them she looked exactly like what she was, a magnificent relic still doing a soldier's job long after the world that had built her for vanity had mostly moved past vanity of that particular kind. And yet no one retired her. No one could quite afford to, and no one perhaps quite wanted to, because a ship that had cost a kingdom's patience to build and a king's own reputation to justify does not get quietly broken up simply because her decoration has faded and her design has aged. She kept her place in the fleet, kept her guns loaded, kept her old gunner and men very much like him, aboard her through wars her original builder never lived to see fought. Her grandest years were behind her, but her most dangerous years, in a different sense, were still ahead, and somewhere down the years, still waiting for her, in a dockyard she had known for most of her long life, a fire was already gathering the conditions it would eventually need. What that fire would need more than anything was ordinary neglect stacked patiently on top of ordinary neglect, and the years before it obliged without any particular malice. Money for the Navy came and went with the tides of politics rather than the tides of the sea, and a dockyard that could not always pay its own ropemakers on time was not a dockyard likely to spend heavily on fire watches for a single aging ship among many. You would not have seen any single moment of carelessness if you had walked those wharves yourself. You would only have seen the usual clutter of a working yard, tar and oakum and old rigging left where hands had last used it, the kind of clutter every dockyard in the world carries without a second thought, because nothing had yet happened to make anyone look at it twice. The old gunner by now had likely seen enough winters aboard her to have stopped counting them exactly, the way men do once a number stops meaning anything useful. He could not have known, standing on her deck through another ordinary refit, that the yard sheltering her through the cold months was the very yard where her story would eventually turn. No one aboard her ever does know that in advance. They only find out afterward, the way the rest of this story is about to find out too. The winter of that year had settled over the dockyard, the way winters always did, damp and slow, the kind of cold that gets into rope and canvas and never quite leaves until spring. Royal Sovereign lay at Chatham, laid up for repair, her guns housed, her upper decks stripped bare for the carpenters who came and went with the tide of ordinary work. If you had walked the wharf that January, you would have seen nothing to mark her out from any other great hull resting through the cold months. No crowd, no ceremony, only the ordinary hush of a yard doing what yards do in winter, waiting for better weather to finish what the frost had interrupted. She had outlived the rain that built her and the admirals who first walked her decks, and by now she carried herself the way old ships do, a little worn at the rail, a little softened in her paint, but still unmistakably herself. No one on the wharf that evening had any reason to look at her twice. That, as it turns out, was exactly the problem. The fire began, as fires in dockyards so often did, with something almost too small to name. A candle left where it should not have been, a spark from a careless hand, a moment of ordinary carelessness that no one thought worth mentioning until it was far too late to matter. You would not have heard an alarm at first, only perhaps a smell drifting across the water, faint and then suddenly not faint at all, the particular sharp bite of tar and old timber beginning to burn. By the time anyone on the wharf understood what they were smelling, the flames had already found the pitch-soaked seams below her deck, and pitch, once it catches, does not ask permission to spread. It runs along a hull the way water runs downhill, following every seam the shipwrights once packed so carefully to keep the sea out, now serving the fire just as well as it ever served against the water. If you had been standing on the Chatham wharf that night, you would have felt the heat before you understood its size, a warmth on your face that had no business reaching you across open water, growing steadily less like warmth and more like something with weight to it. The men who came running from the yard houses would have carried buckets at first, the way men always do, as though a fire aboard the largest ship afloat might yet be answered with buckets. It could not. Whatever machinery Chatham had for fighting fire in those years, and it was modest even by the standards of its own century, arrived to find a blaze already too large for anything but watching. There is no surviving account of a single dramatic stand against it, no chronicler's line about buckets passed hand to hand until dawn. What survives instead is simply the fact of the fire, and the fact of what was left once it had finished. She burned, by every account that has come down, with a thoroughness that left very little argument to be had afterward. The gilding that had once made her the most talked-about hull on the Thames, the carved figures along her stern that a king had once insisted upon at any cost, all of it went the way that gilding and carved oak go when enough heat is given enough time. You do not have to picture the details too closely to understand the shape of it. A fire that begins below decks in an old wooden ship in the depths of winter, with no way to reach the parts of her already alight, tends only one direction. Within hours, what had been the grandest warship of her age, and had lasted longer than nearly anyone expected her to, was reduced to a burned frame settled low in Chatham's mud. There is an old irony in that, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the story moves past it, the way you might sit with a thought just before sleep takes it from you. This was a ship that had weathered war, had carried her guns into battles against the Dutch and the French, had survived storms that broke lesser vessels apart on open water. She had done everything a warship of her age was built to survive. And in the end, none of that mattered, because what took her was not an enemy fleet or a gale, but something almost embarrassingly ordinary. A fire in a dockyard, the kind of accident that happened in one form or another in half the yards of Europe at one time or another. It is not a dramatic ending, and that in its own way is exactly why it lingers. A ship built to survive violence was undone by carelessness. But how does a vessel survive war, weather, and 60 years of hard service, only to be lost like this, burned quietly in her own harbour, on a night that no calendar had marked as significant? That question sat presumably with everyone who watched her burn, and it is worth staying with a little longer before the story moves to what came after. The honest answer is that no ship, however grand, is ever really finished with the ordinary dangers of being made of wood and pitch and tarred rope. Every great vessel of that age lived permanently a few careless moments away from exactly this kind of ending, and most simply never met them. Royal sovereign had outlasted several generations of men who might have burned her sooner, through nothing more than the quiet luck that keeps a candle upright 1,000 nights before the one night it is not. Her survival through 6 decades of active service was not, in the end, evidence that fire could not take her. It was only evidence that it had not yet. As for the men who served aboard her in that final winter, the record is thin in the way dockyard records so often are, full of ships and stores and rarely full of names. There is no surviving account of the old gunner by that point, whether he was still rated to her, whether he had long since moved to another command, or whether he had simply grown too old for sea service and stayed ashore watching the yard he had spent so many winters inside. It is entirely possible he was there that night, among the men who came running with buckets that could do nothing. It is equally possible he had already gone. The sources do not say, and it would be dishonest to pretend they do. What can be said is that the loss of a ship laid up in ordinary refit rather than lost in battle meant that whatever casualties there were went largely unrecorded, absorbed into the yard's own quiet bookkeeping rather than into the kind of report that survives centuries. Dockyard fires were common enough in that era that they rarely generated the paperwork a battle would have demanded. The yard's response, once the flames had done what they were going to do, was practical rather than mournful. There was no lengthy inquiry of the kind a modern disaster might produce, no public reckoning beyond the fact of the loss itself being noted, briefly, in the records that governed the Navy's ships. A vessel that size, even reduced to a burned hulk, still represented material worth salvaging, and Chatham was a yard that understood salvage the way it understood everything else about ships. If your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in this telling, that is exactly the right response to what is left to say here, because what remained afterward was mostly absence rather than event. What was left in the end was a mooring with nothing in it. For 60 years there had been a shape on that stretch of water that everyone in Chatham and everyone along the Thames had learned to expect, a gilded outline against the sky that had once been the largest thing anyone could remember floating. And then, over the course of a single night, it simply was not there anymore. The water where she had ridden went on being water, indifferent to what it had lost, the way water always is. It is that emptiness, more than the fire itself, that the story now has to sit with, the quiet space where a very loud ship used to be, and the slow work of figuring out afterward what exactly had been lost and how much of her, if anything, could ever be accounted for again. What survives of a ship, once the ship itself is gone, is a strange sort of cargo. No timber, no gilding, no smell of tar and salt in the planking. What survives is paper. Inventories, letters, a handful of paintings, the recollections of men who had once stood where you are standing now, in memory, looking up at something enormous. It falls, after Chatham, to historians and naval scholars to do a kind of quiet salvage work, sifting through what was written down at the time and what was drawn, trying to build the ship back up out of ink. You would be forgiven for thinking this an easy task. She was, after all, one of the most famous vessels of her age, painted more than once, described in more than one account, remembered in the ballads that sailors sang about her long after she had gone. But fame is not precision. The men who wrote about her were not always trying to record her for the future. They were trying to impress a patron, or sell a poem, or simply put down what had struck them most on the day they saw her. And so when later scholars turned to the record, hoping to settle her exact dimensions once and for all, they found instead a scatter of numbers that did not quite agree with one another, the way a story told second-hand grows a little in the telling, and grows differently depending on who is doing the telling. Take her gun count, since that is where the disagreement runs deepest. Contemporary accounts gave her over 100 pieces of ordnance across her 3 gun decks, a figure large enough that it was repeated, admired, and occasionally doubted even in her own lifetime. Later refits changed that number outright, adding guns here, removing them there, so that the ship you might picture from an account written in the 1640s is not quite the ship a document from a decade later describes. Naval historians have spent long hours reconciling these figures, cross-referencing them against surviving paybooks and ordnance records, and the honest conclusion, the one you find in the careful footnotes rather than the confident headlines, is that no single number can be called certain for her entire career. She carried different totals at different times, and the sources disagree about several of them. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no figure you need to memorize before your eyes close. It is enough to know that the disagreement itself is part of the record, that even a ship this celebrated, this thoroughly discussed by the people who saw her, resists being pinned down to a tidy specification. The scholars who study her are not failing when they cannot agree. They are doing honest work with imperfect materials, the way anyone does who tries to reconstruct something enormous from what a handful of witnesses happen to write down. Her length and her tonnage present much the same trouble. Estimates from contemporary sources place her burden somewhere above 1,500 tons, though the method of calculating tonnage in the period was itself inconsistent, varying from yard to yard and measurer to measurer, so that a figure quoted with total confidence in one account might simply reflect a different formula than the figure quoted in another. If you imagine a group of scholars standing around a table covered in old shipwrights papers, turning them this way and that under a lamp, trying to work out which formula a particular clerk was using 3 centuries ago, you are not far from the truth of how this kind of history actually gets made. It is patient, uncertain, occasionally maddening work, and it rarely ends in the kind of clean number a documentary voice likes to announce. It ends, more often, in a range, a window of plausible figures, wide enough to be honest, narrow enough to still be useful. But if the ship herself is gone, burned down to her waterline and broken apart afterward for whatever iron and fittings could still be salvaged, what is it then that survives in the archives and the drawings? What exactly are these scholars looking at when there is no hull left to measure? The carvings are where this question becomes most poignant because of everyone who worked on her. It is Gerard Christmas whose contribution has vanished most completely and most visibly. You will remember him from earlier in this story, the master carver brought in to cover her from bow to stern in painted and gilded ornament, mythological figures and royal emblems worked into wood with a patience that bordered on devotion. None of that carving survives, not a fragment, not a splinter with gilt still clinging to it. What survives instead are the written descriptions composed by men who saw the finished work and tried to put it into words, and a small number of illustrations, most famously an engraving made not long after her completion, showing her in profile with her ornament rendered in careful if inevitably simplified detail. Scholars who study naval decoration of the period have had to treat that engraving the way you might treat a single photograph of someone you never met, useful, suggestive, but incomplete, and possibly flattering in ways you cannot fully correct for. The engraver was working from the ship as she appeared, presumably, but engravers of the period were also working within the conventions of their craft, which favored symmetry and clarity over the exact chaos of what carved wood actually looks like at close range. So the image that exists is not quite a record and not quite an invention. It sits somewhere in between, the way most surviving images of things this old tend to. If you have ever looked at an old family photograph and wondered how much of the smile in it was real and how much was held for the camera, you already understand the particular kind of doubt historians live with when they study images like this one. What can be said with more confidence is the character of the carving, if not its precise appearance, the sheer density of figures crowded onto her upper works. The way ornament that on a smaller ship might have been used sparingly was, on her, applied without apparent restraint. Contemporary accounts use words like abundance and profusion, and those words have survived even where the wood has not. It is possible, lying here in the dark with your eyes already beginning to close, to hold that word in your mind without needing anything more precise than it. Abundance. A ship dressed in more carved gold than anyone quite knew what to do with, gone now except for the word itself. Phineas Pett's legacy has fared rather better than Christmas's carvings, if only because what Pett left behind was not a physical object that could burn but a way of working that could be copied. You met him earlier in this story too, the shipwright chosen to design and build her. The man whose family had built ships for the crown for 2 generations before him and would go on building them for at least 1 generation after. His notebooks and his methods, the way he approached the calculation of a hull's proportions, the way he balanced the demands of size against the demands of stability, were studied by the shipwrights who trained under him, and by those who came to the trade afterward, whether or not they ever knew the specific ship that had made his reputation. Naval historians tracing the development of English shipbuilding through the 17th century tend to treat her as a turning point in his career and in the craft more broadly. Proof that a hull this large could be built and could float, whatever the doubts had been beforehand, and proof, too, of how much could go wrong in the years that followed if the ambition was not matched by patient maintenance. It is a strange kind of survival in the end. The man's methods outlived the ship he built with them, carried forward in the hands of shipwrights who never smelled the pitch in Woolwich Yard or watched her clear that narrowed slipway with the crowd holding its breath. The carver's abundance survives only as a word in old accounts and a simplified line in a single engraving. And the ship's own numbers survive as a range rather than a certainty, argued over gently by people who will probably keep arguing over them long after this telling of her story has ended. What is left when you gather all of it together is not a specification at all. It is closer to a portrait remembered by several people who loved or resented or simply marveled at the same face, each carrying away a slightly different version of it. And it is that gathered, imperfect portrait, more than any single number, that the story now has to carry forward into what she ultimately cost and what she was ultimately worth. The tax that paid for her had a name of its own before anyone thought to attach it to a ship, and it is worth sitting with that name for a moment because it outlived the timber by a very long way. Ship money. Say it slowly and it sounds almost domestic, a household expense, a line in a ledger beside the coal and the candles. It was not domestic. It was an old medieval levy dug up out of disuse by a king who had dismissed his parliament and did not intend to ask it for money again. And it was applied not to the ports that had once owed it in wartime, but to every county in the kingdom, coastal or not, in a year when there was no war being fought at all. You do not need to follow the legal argument to feel the shape of what happened. A king wanted a fleet, and rather than ask the elected men of the realm to grant him the money, he found an old law that let him take it without asking. The ship you have been picturing tonight, gilded and vast and floating low under the weight of her own decoration, was the largest single thing that money ever built, and so she became, whether she liked it or not, the argument made visible. There is a man worth remembering here, not because he argued in Parliament or wrote pamphlets, but because he refused to pay. A Buckinghamshire landowner, assessed for a modest sum toward the fleet, decided that the sum itself mattered less than the principle underneath it, and he let the case go to court rather than hand over the coin. He lost. The judges found for the king narrowly, and in finding for the king they told the whole of England something it did not want to hear, that there was, after all, no clear limit on what a monarch could take from his subjects if he called it necessity and dressed it as the old law required. You can imagine how that judgment travelled county to county quicker than any royal proclamation, carried in the kind of low, furious conversation that happens over a fence or a tavern table rather than in any record that survives. It did not need to be written down to do its work. It only needed to be believed, and it was believed almost everywhere. And here is where the ship stops being simply a ship, if she ever was. Every account of the ship money case then and since reaches for her almost by instinct, because she is such a convenient shape for an argument to hang on. A tax that built a road is invisible. A tax that gilds a hull the size of a cathedral, rowed and rigged and floated past every waterside town on the Thames, is not invisible at all. You did not need to read the court reports to understand what your money had gone toward. You only needed to have stood, as thousands of ordinary people did, along the riverbank on the day she was walked to Woolwich, and looked up, and understood that the gold on her stern had come from somewhere, and that somewhere was very likely your own pocket, taken without your consent and dressed up afterward as royal necessity. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no dates to keep straight in the dark, only that feeling of looking up at something extraordinary and knowing in your body before your mind caught up. exactly what it had cost you. Phineas Pett, whose hands had shaped so much of her, was not a man given to writing about politics. His accounts, where they survive, dwell on timber and joints, and the king's satisfaction at each stage of the work, and there is no sign in them that he saw the tax argument coming, or that he thought it his business to see it. He built what he was asked to build, as shipwrights had built for kings before him, and would go on building for whoever held the purse after him. That is not a failing in the man. It is simply the shape of the trade. The hands that raise the hull rarely get a vote in what the hull is asked to justify. But the argument came anyway, whether the shipwrights' yard wanted it or not, and it came to rest on the very ship his hands had made, because there was nothing else quite so large or so gilded for it to rest on. But did the ship herself carry any of that weight, out there on the water, unaware of the arguments made in her name? In one sense, no. She was oak and gold leaf and canvas, and she felt nothing, understood nothing, cared nothing for the court cases fought over the money that built her. She rode the tide the way any hull rides a tide, indifferent to the hands that had paid for her keel. But in the sense that matters for a story like this one, she carried the argument everywhere she went, for the whole of her working life, and for a long while after it ended. Every sailor who served aboard her, every officer who paced her deck, every child on a riverbank who watched her pass, had grown up hearing some version of the ship money case, some grumbling relative's account of a tax that built a golden toy for a king who would not call his parliament. She became shorthand. She became the answer to the question of what royal extravagance actually looked like, made solid enough to touch, gilded enough to resent. And resentment of that particular kind, spread across enough counties and enough years, does not stay contained in a law court. It finds its way, slowly and then all at once, into a civil war. It would be too simple, and this story has tried all the way through to resist the simple version of things, to say that one ship caused a war that had 100 causes older and larger than her. She did not. Religion and money and the rights of parliaments and the temperament of one particular king all pulled in the same direction long before her keel was laid, and would have pulled that way if Phineas Pett had never touched an adze in his life. But she is, of all the objects that survive from that quarrel, the one that makes the quarrel legible at a glance. You can explain the theory of the royal prerogative for an hour and lose most of a room. You can show someone a hull the length of a street, covered in gold that nobody agreed to pay for, and they understand the argument before you have said a word. That is the strange inheritance of a ship built too beautifully for her own good. She outlived her own usefulness as a weapon and became instead permanently useful as a lesson. If your eyes have already closed by now, that is exactly the right way for this to end, because what is left to say is not really about wood or gold at all anymore. It is about the peculiar fact that a kingdom's argument about who gets to ask for money and who gets to refuse to pay it found its clearest expression not in a courtroom, but in a hull floating on the Thames, vast and covered in more gold than any ship before or since, indifferent to the noise on shore, carrying the weight of somebody else's principle, all the way from Woolwich to a slow, structural end, brought about not by an enemy fleet, but by fire, decades later, in a dockyard she had long since outgrown. She began as a king's answer to a question about power. She ended as a hulk, and then as an argument historians still have, gently, about how large she really was and what she was ever worth. And that, I think, is where I will leave her tonight, not sinking, not burning, but simply floating, gilded and enormous, somewhere in the low light of your own imagining, while the argument about her goes on quietly in the background the way it always has, without ever needing you to resolve it before you sleep. Thank you for spending this part of the night with her and with me. If you drifted off somewhere back along the river before the fire, before the courtroom, that is perfectly all right. She will still be there, gilded and patient, whenever you come back to find her. Sleep well, and if you'd like another ship to keep you company some other night, you know where to find me. Rest now.